A reading from Tucker to the Rogans, 2024.
In general, no, they can't control these objects. So, no, it's not American technology.
Well,
or Russian or Chinese. It predates, all of that.
Well, some of it does, right? Like, for sure, the Kenneth Arnold sightings, that was really early on. That was like the early 1950s. He was seeing these flying saucers, these discs that were moving over mountains.
Well, right. I mean, the prophet Ezekiel writes about it in the first chapter, Wheels in the Sky.
Yeah, that's a crazy one. Boy, when you read
it is crazy. If you read it, it's like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And so, and not just, the Hebrew scriptures, like, it's all over every...
the Vedic texts.
Of course. So, these are spiritual phenomena. There's no evidence they're from another planet. I mean, I think that's the lie, that they're from Mars. So they're from here, and they've been here for thousands of years, whatever they are, and it's pretty clear to me that they're spiritual entities, whatever that means. They're supernatural, and which is to say, supernatural means above the natural, above the observable. Okay, so the template that you're using to understand this is like science fiction, right? These are an advanced race of beings from somewhere else. But the template that every other society before us has used is a spiritual one. There is a whole world that we can't see that acts on people, a supernatural world that's acting on us all the time for good and bad. Every society has thought this before ours. In fact, every society in all recorded history has thought that until, I'll be specific, August 1945, when we dropped the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all of a sudden the West is just officially secular. We're God. There is no God but us. But the core idea does not differ, never has differed from caves until now, that we're being acted on by spiritual forces at all times. And so to someone born before or living before 1945, I think it would have been much more obvious that this is the thing that every society has written about. And in fact, that battle, that unseen battle around us, that spiritual battle, has been the basis of every society, of every religion, not just Christianity. So it just, once you discard your very, very recent assumptions, relatively speaking, about how the world works, you're like, well, that kind of seems like the obvious explanation, right?
It's not that obvious to me.
I'm Fritz McLinden, and this is The State Between Us. In Chapter 1 of Revenge of the WASP, I argued that Tucker Carlson has positioned himself as a key man in the post-Trump right in the United States. He represents a growing cadre of losers who see themselves as returning American institutions into the hands of what they imagine to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite, and failing to do so, will find no other path before them but revenge. I warned against regular OK people seeing Tucker as being, quote, on their side since his public turn against Israel, and suggested that his motivations stem from the same roots as an older, very waspy version of magical anti-Semitism called Christian identity, and its amazingly racist notion of the serpent seed line. Now, in Chapter 2, we'll focus on the perennial issues of UFOs, or UAPs, or whatever you want to call them, flying saucers, alien visitations, that kind of thing, that Tucker has taken on alongside Vice President J.D. Vance, and their insistence that these alleged visitations are spiritual phenomena, representing ethereal forces of good and evil. Well, okay, to be fair, we're not spending all that much time on the UFOs themselves, but we are instead exposing the foundations for what is often called UFO religion. I will show how Tucker and J.D. Vance's beliefs betray their alignment to woo-woo obsessed networks of WASP power extending deep into a history of panicked responses to their ever-weakening authority and loss of position in the institutions that the WASP elite once believed were their own. We're going to be talking religious sects, early militias, maybe 2 or 3 theosophies, depending on how you count. We're bringing in a little bit of Hitler worshippers. We're talking about lost continents, ghosts, angels, demons, and shape-shifting reptoids. And boy howdy, and we're going to be talking about some UFOs towards the end there. And in doing so, I hope to uncover the old weird WASP networks of power that J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson, along with many others, are calling back to today. In short, despite UFOlogy claiming to be a popular front at war with a shadowy elite for the truth, the very belief in extraterrestrial visitation is probably one of the most elitist, whiteiest, and fash-coded beliefs that one could take on today. And I say this with the humblest apologies to my friends and listeners who approach this field with genuine curiosity and who enjoy the spark of imagination and wonder that UFOlogy brings them. I'm reminded, though, of Marx's famous but misunderstood statement on religion under capitalism.
Religion is the opium of the people. It is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of our soulless conditions.
I understand, and I agree, that UFOs and spiritual visitations and magic and lost continents are all really cool, and I love them too. I love them. I freely borrow from these often very problematic lore bases for my own TTRPG games and stuff like that. Of course, I add little twists and whatnot, but in loving them, I think we got to get a lot choosier about what kinds of people we are feeding with our attention and avoid turning our fancy into reality-denying fetish. My fear is that the tree of beliefs that we are covering today will be a powerful wedge for the post-MAGA American fascism already thundering on the horizon. And my hope is that learning about the seed that planted it will keep us from getting lost up in its crazy canopy. But to those in socialist and anarchist and communist and anti-fascist spaces that have pretenses to revolution or the overcoming of these great old powers and relations, but still insist on parroting fashy, conspira-brained, anti-science takes and promoting this, what I'm arguing today is the remnants of a WASP elite spirituality, I have much less grace for those types. It's time to maybe move on or to come to terms with the fact that you are comfortable on the opposite side of history than you've been claiming. And this history, my friends, is a long one.
Part 1. Manny, the first astronaut of the 18th century.
UFOs have never been a scientific problem. Not really. They've always been a spiritual one. In the mid-18th century, a wealthy Swedish Borg named Swedenborg was visited by one Jesus H. Christ. Jeezy granted Emanuel Swedenborg the power to visit heaven and hell, but more than that, he unlocked the mystic powers of Manny's brain, allowing him to psychically commune with all the inhabitants of the solar system with a technique that is really no different than what people today call astral traveling, an important method in the 20th century ufology mythos. Swedenborg visited Jupiter, communed with the philosophical and a little judgy inhabitants of Saturn, and he traded philosophy with moonmen and Martians. He learned that the world had already ended in 1757, and all that stood between that gooey, wet grossness of human existence and the great beyond was the mastery of great men over the physical and spiritual divide. Emanuel Swedenborg developed a cosmological system of correspondences, as above, so below, you might say, wherein the base reality of the material world also existed in a spiritual realm. The soul was a physical reality, and travel between the planets, even the stars themselves, was not only possible, but simple for the master through interdimensional means. To my knowledge, this was the origin of the idea of alien visitation, except it was Emmanuel that was the visitor. Manny Swedenborg died in 1772, but his mostly English followers grew quickly in both number and devotion to their magical Manny, founding the New Church in 1787, sometimes called the New Jerusalem Church. Numerous theological tensions between the New Church and the Church of England isolated Swedenborg's disciples from the mainstream for a while, but when the French Revolution rolled around a couple years later, the New Church took a vocally counter-revolutionary stance and declared their loyalty to the British imperial state, and the Anglican establishment opened their arms to them. Within the British Empire, figures like Reverend Augustus Clissold and John Close worked hard to merge Swedenborgian mysticism into Anglican theology and met great success. In the recently liberated United States, that role fell to the man who gave the defining sermon at the First Continental Congress, Jacob Duché. There's a little accent mark over the E in D-U-C-H-E, which is why I pronounce it Duché. But if I start calling him Jakey Douche or something dumb like that, you'll know who I mean. So Duché was a prominent Episcopalian in the new state and a devoted Swedenborgist who, despite his role in the American Revolution, spent his late life advocating for the U.S. to heal their relationship with the British Crown. More importantly for us, though, it was this douche who created the first Swedenborgist operation in America, the Theosophical Society. Fans of the infamous huckster Helena Blavatsky might be surprised to learn this fact. I know that I was. But the truth is that contemporary theosophy, complete with its correspondences and psychic woo-woo and the fetishization of the Far East, etc., was originally an 18th century creation. Blavatsky, more than likely, consciously aped almost 100 years later. Theosophy itself as a term has German Lutheran origins too in the 17th century, and writers on Swedenborg concede that Manny was clearly influenced by Jacob Boehme's original theosophical arguments about the unity of God, man, and nature. But I would argue that Jacob Duché's theosophy was a bit closer to how we understand Blavatsky's theosophy later, and that's entirely because of Swedenborg's journey across the solar system. Now, don't worry if this is the first time you're hearing the word theosophy and Helena Blavatsky. We'll talk a little more about it later, but just think like ascended master cults, think gurus, magic powers, racism, and very, very rich people with little else to do in their well-appointed New England mansions in the late 19th century. But back to the story. So we can't dwell too long in the 18th century because we've got 2 more centuries of wacky nonsense to get through today. So let me just quickly sum up this opening point before I add another loony to the tale here. Anglicanism in the United Kingdom and its U.S. iteration, Episcopalianism, were heavily imbued with the theosophy of Emanuel Swedenborg and his new church. In fact, Swedenborgian mysticism was pretty much the coolest thing going for woo-woo-minded rich white people as the 18th century crept into the 19th, and it became a clear marker of high society in post-revolution America and an indelible facet of early WASP elitism. Okay, so now that other loony I promised. So Swedenborg's influence was not only felt in the mystically minded Anglican and Episcopalian circles of Clissold, Close, and Duché. In the mid-1790s, Swedenborg also captured the fancy of a Royal Navy officer and an absolute snack named Richard Brothers. Dick Brothers also talked to Jesus like Manny had done and came out convinced that the return of the Jews to the biblical land of Palestine would trigger a new era of history and see the end of King Charles. That said, Brothers was still an imperialist at heart and believed in the superiority of white European society. He also told everyone that he was the literal descendant of King David and that the chosen people had, over time, adopted English, French, and other European identities secretly. Is that sounding a little familiar? Well, if you were paying attention to part 1 of The Revenge of the Wasp, released a couple months ago, I suspect you already realized that Brothers, at the end of the 18th century here, is literally inventing British Israelism, and Swedenborg's theosophy was one of his key ingredients. Also, maybe keep in mind, in the back of your mind, that we're looking here also at the primitive foundations of evangelical Zionism and dispensationalism here as well, but just stow that away for this episode. I would recommend checking out The State Between Us episodes 3, 5, 8, and 23 on patreon.com/The State Between Us for more on all of that. But that does it for part 1 of this episode. Easy peasy. Swedenborg brings us space aliens and theosophy, and his followers managed to weave his teachings into 2 peak WASP spiritual institutions, the Episcopalian Church and British Israelism, and somehow, indirectly, set the religious tone for the United States at the very first Continental Congress. In part 2, we're going to, let's say, Kool-Aid Man ourselves against the wall of the 19th century and just bust right through it. Oh, yeah! While we're there, we'll be kind of shifting in and out of overt Swedenborgist circles, but you just know for now that the new church and the Swedenborgists within the Episcopalian WASP elite do very well for themselves throughout the 1800s. And perhaps this is best exemplified by the end of that century in the Swedenborgist New Jerusalem Chapel that is built at Harvard University in 1901 by the founder of the Harvard Architectural School, an ardent Swedenborgian, Herbert Langford Warren, which to this day has an active Swedenborgish chaplaincy. So it's not like any of this disappeared, and it remains an indicator of one's genealogy and the class composition of America over time.
Chapter 2. The 19th Century's Woo-Woo White Folk in the Age of Spiritualism.
I'm going to try and keep our path through the 19th century straight and narrow and quick, but I should warn you that I will fail. Since this episode is about the foundations of the UFO phenomenon, I want to focus on that thread, but just know that there's a very important, let's say, cluster of side stories that are about the idea of psi, PSI, ESP, telepathy, mind control, interdimensional travel, all that shit. Good side stories, fun stuff, all wacky, evolving through this process that will be inseparable from the overall scene that UFOs become part of in the 20th century. We'll talk about a lot of that in this episode, but there's just so much gold in those hills. We can't carry it all in one trip, so we're going to be leaving a lot of the story behind, but I promise you we'll pick it up at a future date. It's too good. So today we're basically skipping the first half of the 19th century of WASP eliteness and the growth of the Swedenborgist New Church to get right into the 1840s, the decade, by the way, when British Israelism finally became a full-fledged movement, and where, entirely apart from all of that, all sorts of good woo gets going in the tippiest of the toppiest of high society. Now, while we're still deep in WASP country, though, we're going to step away from Episcopalians for a moment and bring in some other big names from the wider WASP world that will help us eventually get to the UFO religion. I think we got to start with George Bush. You heard that right. George Bush was the first cousin of Obadiah Bush, the 19th century patriarch, the Bush family, that would eventually give us Nazi collaborators, CIA heads, and US presidents, those guys, those Bushes, the Bush dynasty that you know and love today.
And freedom is beautiful. And, it'll take time to restore chaos and order, order out of chaos, but we will.
Obadiah's worldview was heavily influenced by George Bush's, his cousin George Bush's, cosmology, joining his Presbyterian theologian cousin in the fight for the abolition of slavery, also a very important thing in Swedenborgism, as well as into George's controversial contribution to the Presbyterian extended universe. And what was that contribution? Well, should be no surprise at this point to learn that between 1845 and 1847, George Bush became a vocal advocate of a super mystical combo of Swedenborgism, which George Bush studied voraciously, and the 18th century pseudoscientific concepts, which still haunt us today, mesmerism and animal magnetism. These concepts posited, among other wacky things, that all life was connected by a magnetic spiritual field where minds could read each other telepathically, including the minds of trees. George Bush believed that mesmerism helped prove Swedenborgian concepts like astral travel and the correspondences between the spirit world above and the meat world below. I mean, the fact that this guy is in this story still kind of fucks with my head. This dude represents a direct lineage from, with Borg magic in the 19th century to the fucking head of the CIA in the 20th. You can't make that stuff up. I should add that my old pal Kemal would probably kill me if I didn't at least mention here that George Bush was the preeminent Hebrew scholar of his day and also wrote the first English language biography of Muhammad the Prophet. That's for you, Kemal. While Bush was doing his part to create a generation of overpowered monsters and reading the long-dead Emanuel Swedenborg, another dude was out in the Catskill Mountains actually talking to Swedenborg's ghost. And this man, Andrew Jackson Davis, was a nobody, really. A shoemaker with an alcoholic father and a really weird mom, who, despite her middle-class Protestant upbringing, was obsessed with omens and the idea of clairvoyance. Andrew Jackson Davis's name alone suggests the politics of his family. He was clearly named for President Andrew Jackson, who was then credited, rightly or wrongly, with loosening the grip over American democracy that the old money Dutch and English families had monopolistically held since the country's founding. Now, Andy Davis is claiming to be in contact with Swedenborg's ethereal form. And since he wasn't actually from those elite Swedenborgist WASP circles, he didn't seem to know too much about Swedenborg's theology. But by and large, the public didn't really care that much and marveled at the idea that spirits of great men, masters, wandered among us. Some say it was in fact Andy's chats with Manny, the Swedenborg's ghost, that birthed the spiritualism craze that was soon to wash over the elite classes of 19th century America. This will prove to be a pattern as we progress through this story. While the ruling class gripped onto these mystical networks of thought like heirlooms of their elite ancestry, it was often those outside of such circles that made new pathways for these networks to spill out into mass culture. Spiritualism really picked up in 1848 with the Fox sisters scamming rich families in New York with seances and stuff like that. The movement rocked the Anglophonic world, but it was a LARP that the Swedenborg-influenced mystic-minded elites could live with. This was less so for Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species, The Science of Evolution, etc. They were a bit less happy about that. The crisis of faith that this publication engendered among the ruling elite can't be it can't be totally known, but it shouldn't be understated either. They built the scientific institutions that built Charlie, and now Charlie was telling them that the entire spiritual infrastructure of their own sense of self-worth and superiority might be bullshit. Okay, he was much nicer about that, much nicer than he probably should have been, but nonetheless, the data was there, and it was coming from one of their own. As spiritualism bloomed on both sides of the Atlantic, a French nut named Allan Kardec, a Roman Catholic, who had been drawn into the Anglo-Protestant mysticism, invented Spiritism, a mixture of ghosts and pseudoscience that cited Swedenborg as its progenitor in its own journals in the late 1850s, and it was making inroads into Victorian upper-class society in London. The great manly man minds of the London intellectual scene decided to form a debating club that they called the Metaphysical Society in 1869 to settle the great questions of matter, spirit, and history, and supposedly science a little bit, they claimed, which by its final meeting in 1880 would boast around 62 very fancy members, including the father of 20th century mystic author and eventual MK Ultra participant Aldous Huxley, including Arthur Balfour of the fucking Balfour Declaration, including Henry Sidgwick of the Institute of Psychical Research, and many other upper crust luminaries that we don't have time for, or I guess probably interest. The panicked members of the Metaphysical Society chastised poor Charlie Darwin for daring to publish The Descent of Man in 1871, and, quote,
revealing his zoological conclusions to the general public at a moment when the sky of Paris was red with the incendiary flames of the Commune.
These guys were all freaking out about their class position and what they had assumed was a natural order, beginning to crumble now before their eyes. Here they attempted to meld science, religion, and mysticism into a single serious inquiry, and of course, being kind of a dumb idea, were unable to do so. They were unable to come to terms. Everybody just got entrenched in their own things, whatever. It's as you would expect. But despite this fact, that climate of tension between science and mysticism, let's say, gave birth to some pretty important elements in what would become UFO-ology in the next century. Which brings me, briefly, to the Gregg family, and I think, broadly speaking, the first generation of modern space-bound science fiction. William Rathbone Gregg was born into English cotton money, his dad having owned a key mill in Cheshire and enjoyed an elite education in Edinburgh, although he was never able to break out in the industry as his own man. He was a rabid elitist, believed that women were, quote, redundant in society, and despised the unwashed masses for their ignorance about high-minded abstract concepts. He distrusted democracy and was really, really racist. He joined the elite Metaphysical Society in 1871, writing a critique of Darwin's Descent of Man, in which he allows Darwin the legitimacy of evolutionary theory in general, but urges Charlie to accept Billy Gregg's idea that evolution stops with man. All that was left to evolve after that was spirit. To support his claim, he pointed to the spiritual differences in Germanic and African peoples, claiming, unsurprisingly, that Germans seemed more evolved and Africans seemed destined to be hardy but dumb workers. I mean, who'd have guessed? Who'd have guessed that a cotton magnate would say something so fucking racist? How strange. The point is that despite not being a Swedenborgist in any way, by this time, the idea that the spirit evolves in the higher and higher forms and expecting those forms to reflect back on the races of the earth in a system of correspondences seemed pretty obvious even to Billy Gregg and the Metaphysical Society of really scared rich guys. So, of course, I mentioned sci-fi. Well, Billy Gregg had a kid named Percy Gregg, very much his father's son. As Reconstruction was being killed in its crib after the American Civil War, Percy liked to write about how chattel slavery totally ruled, and that the original KKK were civilizational heroes who fought the good fight. He also liked to write some of the earliest space-based science fiction. Percy Gregg invented the concept of apergy, which was the first known word for the concept of anti-gravity, a fake engineering magic that allows ships to just flit around without any worry about the realities of gravity. Needless to say, anti-grav is a vital piece of the pseudoscientific tropes of 20th century UFO-ology, and strangely enough, the plantation money connection will even survive in the form of Duke University's ESP research labs way out there in the 1930s and wacky anti-gravity investigations after World War II. Duke University, named, of course, for the tobacco and hydroelectric mogul James Buchanan Duke, who was really into this kind of stuff. A fun side detail about Percy Gregg: while the young Gregg heir was writing, he also probably invented the word astronaut in his novel Across the Zodiac from 1880, and he also kicked off the sword and planet genre of classic science fiction, as well as having the claim to the first fictionalized alien language in the genre. Part 3. Manhattan gets metaphysical. From London, we're back in Manhattan again as Percy Gregg's sci-fi books hit the shelves. Alongside fanciful tales of adventure, there was also a free exchange of both mystical ideas and attempts to find modern rationalizations for them between the US and the old empire. Two wealthy families of old military aristocracy and an unlikely mystical duo will help us further down the rabbit hole.
Rabbits don't dig holes.
The rest of this part of the episode takes place in Manhattan, and we'll begin with a visit to our two wealthy families, the Astors and the Jameses. Let's start with the famous Episcopalian Astor family of Waldorf Astoria renown and a genuinely ancient lineage in Old English, German, and Huguenot elites. And we'll look at their relationship to the relatively nouveau riche Presbyterian James family of celebrated literary and philosophical luminaries. The Astor family, led in the late 19th century by John Jacob Astor IV, until he died on the Titanic, could not have had a shinier coat in the WASP world. And it was from this great social height that J.J. Astor wrote a groundbreaking American sci-fi novel, A Journey in Other Worlds, A Romance of the Future, in 1894. It imagined a bizarre geopolitical future in the year 2000, where the socialists had taken over Europe and sold off all the European colonies to the United States, who thus became the only source of innovation in the whole world. Now, it probably won't surprise you to learn that Astor was blooded as a military elite in the Spanish-American War that made the United States a modern colonial power and participated in some of the same campaigns that State Between Us favorite Smedley Butler regretted his own role in years later. Astor, by contrast, didn't regret shit, and in his lore, massive American corporations heroically exploit Jupiter as private enterprises literally tilt the axis of the planet Earth. Space travel is possible through John Jacob Astor's direct borrowing of Percy Gregg's concept of apergy. Now, Astor's hyper-colonial big business take on the conquering of space would largely become how regular Americans came to think of sci-fi as a whole, best represented probably by the Campbellian strain, the John Campbell strain of science fiction that gave us people like Robert Heinlein in the 20th century and his very fashy career as a Cold War hawk, an author of Starship Troopers, etc. I'll put some link in the description for work I did on that with the Zokbok Radio podcast. But this idea of a sort of space manifest destiny is the exact model that Dan O'Bannon inverted as a dystopia in his Alien series in the 1970s. But that whole trope is just kind of picking up right now here at the end of the 19th century with John Jacob Astor IV and with an assist from British clan apologist Percy Gregg. But that's not even the interesting part. While Jupiter played the part of Latin America for John Jacob Astor IV, a bountiful resource ripe for exploitation, Saturn was very different. In his lore, Saturn is a planet of discarnate native spirits, as well as those who had traveled from Earth upon their bodies' deaths, a place where spirits of ancient masters waited with true wisdom from the spirit world to share with us. Saturn could not be more of a Swedenborgist utopia. True, Astor was an Episcopalian, though not much is out there to suggest that his family intersected at all with overtly Swedenborgian circles, even though his religion could never again be truly independent of it either. But my strong assumption is that these elements of Astor's popular sci-fi novel came directly from his close friend and rival, his neighbor, Henry James Sr., who, apart from being fabulously wealthy, happened to be a Swedenborgist minister. And that's our other wealthy Manhattan family of the day. A contemporary of George Bush.
And you're working hard to put food on your family.
The other George Bush. Henry was also converted to the new church from Presbyterianism in the 1840s and contributed key translations and analysis to the American Swedenborgian tradition. Henry James Sr.'s youngest son was born in the luxury of an Astor hotel. Henry named him William and raised him to be a devout Swedenborgian. Many of you hearing this now might be familiar with William James, especially those of you coming from the study of philosophy or psychology, as William is still today considered by many both to be the father of American psychology and the first American philosopher, though not as many people know that a large part of James's motivation for undertaking American psychology was to unlock people's latent psychic potential. James's influence on American common culture is probably incalculable, but it is very Swedenborgy. We don't need to get too in-depth with William James's sort of cultural contributions to American woo-woo right now. That's the sort of thing that a lore dump about Project Stargate would probably need. But for our purposes, which, just to remind you, is simply establishing that UFO-ology is an original branch of WASP identity and power, it is enough to know that James's fame and celebrity made him a central node for the passage of increasingly strange ideas into the WASP mainstream, which will have a major impact on UFO culture in the next century. Specifically, I'm referring to the return of Theosophy to the WASP Swedenborgian world, which moves us now from the wealthy family part of this chapter to the unlikely mystical duo part of this chapter. William James joined the infamous New York-based Theosophical Society of Russian huckster Helena Blavatsky and Civil War veteran and all-around weird guy Henry Steele Olcott in 1882. Shortly afterwards, William James became president of Old Metaphysical Society guy Henry Sidgwick's Society for Psychical Research in the UK. The Theosophical Society may or may not have drawn its name from the original Swedenborgian Theosophical Society of Jacob Duché from about a century prior. Blavatsky dubiously claims it was randomly drawn from a dictionary, but scholars do note that Olcott and Blavatsky were well read in Swedenborgianism, so I still kinda think they borrowed it from Duché, to be honest. Blavatsky herself quoted Swedenborg often and at length in her 1877 book, Isis Unveiled, calling him a, quote, natural-born magician, and accepting his belief that the ages of the old church had passed, and that the new church must find itself in what they fetishized as the ancient wisdom of the Far East.
We prefer decidedly to take the word of Swedenborg that the ancient world is somewhere in China or the Great Tartary.
Apart from appropriating colonized people's traditions and symbols from their swanky digs in Manhattan, the Theosophical Society went all in on the idea of super ancient advanced civilizations, and in their search for the mythical Pacific counterpart to Atlantis called Lemuria, they would repeat the path of Andrew Jackson Davis meeting Swedenborg in the Catskills and seek out departed ascended masters in the northwest of the United States, specifically on Mount Shasta. The Theosophical septenary system of energy rays was entirely based on Swedenborgish chats that Blavatsky was having with the alien lords of Venus. I mean, it's colorful stuff, but you can't really call it unique. It certainly helped that the eminent Swedenborgist William James was legitimizing their woo-woo in both academic institutions and wider society. Theosophy, with its obsession over ancient, lost, possibly psychic civilizations within the hollow earth, as well as their popularization of the ascended master tradition, was poised to become the spiritual basis of some of the most fucked up elements of fascist lore and the near-future foundations of UFO lore, especially the good old ancient aliens thesis. All thanks to a bunch of Swedenborgers and a cast of super elite WASP suckers with very active imaginations. I'll tie this together more tightly for you when we break into the 20th century now, but I hope at the very least I've given you a sense of the genealogical consistency behind the most important building blocks from which UFO culture would soon be constructed. Remember that UFO-ology has never been, and kind of can never be, a science. It is a religion. And religions are, as I've pointed out in the last episode of Revenge of the WASP, not merely beliefs, but networks of believers that are traceable through time. We have not just been looking at the transmission of these building blocks in history, but also to the meat space of those transmitters themselves. Which takes us now to part 4.
The 20th century's conspiracy of conspiracies.
The influence of Theosophy on the woo-woo militant right wing of American society should not be overstated. Not to mention even what it did to the actual Nazis in Germany. That's a totally different story. The key players that would carry the bulk of the early weight of post-World War II ufology would largely come out of the interwar fascist militia movement in the US and the new dispensationalist and Christian identity scenes, both of which were themselves extensions of high-class WASP fuckery of ages past. We're not going to get to those today. I'm just trying to show you the WASP spiritual origins of UFOs here, and we'll leave the big Amerifash stories for some other time. If you're finding yourself a bit confused about Theosophy still, it's a very popular topic. And at this point, there are plenty of podcasts and other media using multiple scholarly sources out there and doing thoughtful analyses beyond your typical freak of the week model for those who are still burdened by a bee in their Blavatsky bonnet. For our purposes, Blavatsky and Olcott's version of Theosophy just functions as a meeting point of multiple borrowed traditions. It's true, as is often claimed, that the Theosophical Society was largely responsible for 20th century mysticism and anti-science obscurantism, but as with most narcissistic scam artists, their cosmology is basically just rebranded claims from the last century and a very colonial co-optation of East and South Asian traditions that Buddhist scholars sometimes refer to as, quote, Protestant Buddhism. Like that goofy metaphysical society back in the UK, the Theosophical Society reacted to Darwin with a panicked attempt to rationalize their bullshit with contemporary science by coming up with the idea of the root races, quote unquote, of man, which opened up a lot of possibilities for UFOs of the future, and included a kind of new race developing of, guess what, American white people, based on the southern side of the Mason-Dixon line, who would, I guess, be the most advanced race yet. I'm going to boil the first half of the 20th century down to a few key moments here, mostly happening at around the same time, that will set the tone for the Cold War religion of UFOlogy with all its branching awfulnesses. First in line is Ray Palmer, a pioneer publisher of sci-fi and fantasy beginning from around 1938, and importantly for us, also of occult woo-woo, and giving us our original mental images of alien spacecraft. Ray Palmer believed that he saved himself from a grotesque spinal condition by thought power, an extension of the New Thought movement, which grew up alongside spiritualism and neo-mesmerist Swedenborgist shit from the Bush and James families. He was one of those very WASP kinds of Christian, obsessed with the end of the world, and would later write for the Assemblies of God. His family were Ulster Protestants, engaged in the imperialistic terror campaigns against the Irish. He was not a theosophist, but his publications like Amazing Stories, Fate, and other magazines, including one called Flying Saucers, further popularized the mythological themes and claims of theosophy, especially his interest in the lost continent of Lemuria. In March of 1945, Palmer published the literal rantings of a madman named Richard Shaver. Dick Shaver was deeply afflicted by powerful emotional and mental disorders, as well as inspired by theosophical ideas about discarnate spirits and their reincarnation. And he believed that he possessed within him the ancient soul of a long-dead Lemurian named Muton Mion. Shaver believed that he was reliving his past life in Lemuria through the memories of Muton, and Ray Palmer, sensitive to such heavy matters of occult and spirit, had his own visions of swimming in cash money. Despite publishing Shaver's stories as true tales and adding copious editorial notes claiming to have researched all these claims, Palmer heavily rewrote the Shaver mysteries to make them as fun and profitable as possible, squeezing a strange but, enjoyable adventure story out of this poor, crazy guy's delusions. Sadly, plenty of people were gullible enough to actually believe the veracity of Shaver's story, but even those who weren't were fascinated by his depictions of interplanetary alien spacecraft, and not to mention the idea that they were of a very ancient and forgotten civilization. Palmer capitalized on this new need for extraterrestrial spacecraft and ancient aliens by tailoring Shaver's ongoing rantings to his readers' desires. Within only a couple of years, these ideas had leaked into mainstream American culture, though they had yet to become a full-on lunatic craze. That would all change in June of 1947. A rancher in the wider Roswell area of New Mexico, near the Alamogordo Army Airfield, found the busted-up remains one day of a spy balloon on his property. This balloon was a casualty of Project Mogul, a secret attempt to use high-altitude balloons to detect Soviet nuclear tests. The rancher, a guy named Mac, was befuddled by the wreckage, but didn't think too much of it at first. That all changed a couple weeks later, when way up in Mount Rainier in Washington State, a pilot and businessman named Kenneth Arnold was flying around, and he claimed to see multiple shiny objects that he said moved erratically, quote,
like a saucer would if you skipped it across the water.
In the unfurling shadow of sci-fi's increasing focus on alien spacecraft, as well as worries about Soviet air capabilities, the press was immediately attracted to Ken's claims. And also, not being a very serious story, there was a little less pressure to get certain details right, and Kenneth Arnold's description of their saucer-like erratic movement became a description of their saucer-like form. Thus, the flying saucer was born. Ken's description of these craft would change and adapt to contemporary sci-fi conventions as time went on, and they would continue to do so throughout the career that he eventually made off of it. So back in New Mexico, at the beginning of July, our rancher Mac visits a buddy who suggests to him that it might be one of those things that Ken Arnold saw, one of those flying saucers, and he should probably tell the news. Apparently, Mac did that, but he also had the patriotic fortitude to call up the Roswell Army Airfield, who worried that press accounts might tip the hand of Project Mogul to the KGB. Public Information Officer, that is to say Air Force spin guy, one Walter Haut, visited Mac's ranch and listened to Mac suggest that it might have been one of Ken Arnold's flying saucers. And Walter Haut, right away, drops a press release saying that he had recovered debris from a, quote, flying disc. Now, calling this a disc was a pretty bold move, considering that what they had in front of them was a literal pile of tin foil, rubber bits, sticky tape, and wood. But the rest, as they say, is history. This half-assed cover-up of a short-lived spy balloon program, combined with Ken Arnold's ever-mutating report on his flying objects and the popular Shaver stories that Ray Palmer was cashing in on, produced a mass obsession with flying saucers from other worlds that would soon be renamed UFOs, unidentified flying objects. It is worth noting here that there has always been a tension between the mechanical idea of UFOs and the spiritual one, but they share common origins. From the very first publication of Ken Arnold's story, an entire branch of ufology was born that believed his sightings to be either angelic or demonic visitations.
I don't think they're aliens. I think they're demons anyway, but that's a longer discussion.
We will have to do a follow-up episode on patreon.com/thestateBetweenUs in the near future that spends more time on the very strong fascist connection to UFO beliefs and all the varieties of it. But for now, let's just talk about some of the key players at the beginning of that cultural process. So the Great Depression in the United States created a lot of depression, desperate and spiritually vulnerable people who were made into easy meals for the gathering wolves of the 20th century. In previous episodes, I've discussed the growth of dispensationalist evangelical movements in this time and their ties to very evil, scammy freaks and their KKK affiliates. It was a time when the, quote, power of positive thinking became a key tactic for predators from Christian Science and the New Thought movement. Building from the strands of Christian mysticism that we've been discussing, absolute pieces of shit like Claude Doggins, William Dudley Pelley, and Guy Ballard managed to pull together deeply racist and conspiratorial cults from elements of Swedenborgism, Theosophy, mesmerism, animal magnetism, and spiritualism. After 1947, all of them adopted UFOs into their cults, their militias, their coup attempts, and their scams, and in doing so created much of the early infrastructure of the American WASP religion of ufology. Claude Doggins, better known by his scam artist name Maurice Doreal, claimed to have revealed ancient emerald tablets in a pyramid at Giza in 1925. Borrowing heavily from Conan the Barbarian creator Robert E. Howard's King Kull storyline, again, that's fantasy writing, Doggins essentially invented the shape-shifting reptilian alien that would later define the infamous David Icke's bizarre connection to right-wing groups in the latter half of the 20th century. Michael Barkun notes that Doggins' reptilians bear a strong resemblance to the serpent seedline narrative of the still-developing Christian identity movement at that time of anti-black WASP revanchists that we saw in the last episode of Revenge of the WASP. This is, of course, no accident. Doggins himself actually wrote a book at the beginning of 1940 that was called The 10 Lost Tribes of Israel.
Ironically, the word Jew, do you know what it means?
It comes from Judah.
Of Judah.
Right.
So who
Which
are the
is
11?
One of 12 tribes.
Yeah, who are the 11? There's so many muddled terms here that's so ironic to me.
But that is kind of burying the headline. In the early 1930s, Doggins created the Brotherhood of the White Temple in Colorado, based on his experiences in the Neo-Theosophical movement. He claimed to have met the ascended master spirits of a pair of Atlanteans, who were for some reason on the Pacific coast of Mount Shasta, Pacificans, who taught him about the lost races and civilizations hidden deep below the hollow earth. Among them were the aforementioned reptilians, the reptoids that he stole from the Conan the Barbarian series, whom he concluded were in fact extraterrestrial beings aligned with the Antichrist, and who were now secretly running the Soviet Union and using communism as their dastardly wedge for world domination. Needless to say, the birth of the UFO at the end of World War II and Cold War paranoia and religious fervor kept his hustle alive and relevant until he died in 1963. Also skulking around Mount Shasta in 1930 was Doggins' most successful contemporary, Guy Ballard, of the still surviving I Am movement, or I Am activity movement. This was either the first or among the first offshoot cults from Theosophy in the 20th century, originally based out of a Presbyterian church. Guy Ballard and his wife Edna met the long-dead Saint Germain up on that same mountain, Mount Shasta, guided by the same theosophical blueprint as Doggins, and this ascended master spirit told the Ballards that, surprise, surprise, communism was the greatest evil in the world, and what was needed was essentially a Christian fascist coup to take the state and run it as a Christian mystical theocracy. He also met a bunch of Venusians, people from Venus, who had more or less the same message and some fun updates to Theosophy. Ballard sold countless books to his gullible followers in the I Am movement, promising all sorts of crazy bunk about eternal life and reincarnation, and even convincing his devotees to murder their own pets to release the trapped human spirits inside of them. Although Ballard died before the UFO craze really began, his I Am movement and its offshoots were quick to incorporate ufology into their crypto-fascist cult, no doubt feeling that the phenomena lent further credibility to their founders' claim to have hung out with Venusians. In case I hadn't mentioned it before, it's important to know that this Venusian thing is very much part of the Blavatsky Theosophy tradition. Both Doggins' White Temple and the Ballards' I Am activity cult were further influenced by the mystical Christian fascism of William Dudley Pelley, founder of the Silver Shirts and early contributor to right-wing militia movements. Bill Pelley, as a younger man, was part of the American imperial spy network of missionaries in China, like his contemporary John Birch, actually, before becoming a short story author and a screenwriter. Pelley met his own, quote, mentor spirits a couple years before Doggins and the Ballards, back in 1928, in a purple ether in the Pacific Northwest. Pelley, struggling to break out in the film industry, despite having authored a couple of decent productions, kind of made this his new thing. Pelley did also believe that his failures in the, quote, flesh pots of Hollywood were due to a Jewish conspiracy that had infected America. To make a long story very, very short, and I would say possibly straining the boundaries of accuracy, a higher dimensional mentor spirit of Jesus basically told Pelley after Hitler's rise to power that Hitler was an ascended master and Pelley is just the Hitler of the US and he should really go for it.
But when we refer to the Christian Commonwealth, what is the connotation? I can put it in 20 words for you. We are talking about both a cultural and economic state where the high ethical principles and precepts of the Christ are established politically.
From his base in North Carolina, Pelley, with Jesus' blessing, declared himself the Führer and launched an unsuccessful presidential run. Like the Ballards and Doggins, Pelley was vicious in his contempt for FDR and the New Deal, which of course he saw as a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy to replace WASP rule in the U.S.
The people who built National Cathedral on the highest point in Washington, D.C., one of the most beautiful buildings in the United States, were Episcopalians. And now it's populated by people who share almost nothing in common with the people who built it. Power is the ability to restore order.
While the I Am movement was a huge fan of Pelley's and adopted much of his openly Nazi spiritualism, Pelley's fascist zealotry and theatrics put a big spotlight on his activities, and as the true scamminess of his, quote, Christian economics school was exposed, Pelley found himself in prison several times for a mix of scams and charges of sedition. When he finally got out in 1950, he immediately started a new hustle he called Soulcraft, a mix of self-help bullshit and UFO worship that once again found itself mixed in with the post-Ballard I Am cult of the time. So that's just a sampling, really, of how this kind of old elite WASP network around Swedenborgism and spiritualism, theosophy, etc., built the basic foundations for contemporary UFO culture in America. So now I'm going to offer, I guess, what is a half conclusion for a half of a story. From its very inception, UFOlogy was a spiritual phenomenon. An offhanded cover story by a lazy Air Force press wrangler instantly found itself connected to the developing mythos of WASP mysticism. No longer a discrete indicator of old money status or elite networks, Swedenborg-derived Christian occultism finally broke through the class dam exactly as these woo-woo networks of white wealth were being replaced by much more diverse populations of managers in post-war America. And also scholars and academics, etc., etc. Their institutions had slipped away. This was a powerful moment for those dangling just outside of those networks of old moneyed power, but who still wanted to be identified with that lineage. UFOs became a way for them to push their ideas of ascended guru guys magic thought powers, spirits, racial separatism, and anti-science confusion into a very modern format. The enormity of the mania allowed their followers to convince themselves that massive cover-ups must be occurring, and the intermixing of anti-Semitic propaganda like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, early Holocaust denialism, communist or other alien takeovers of government institutions, and so on, all of this went into the very foundations of UFO mythology and created a system that Michael Barkun calls stigmatized knowledge, which in this case meant believing in secret sciences and histories suppressed by satanic reptilian communist Jewish forces. Tucker and Vance have positioned themselves as the new hucksters of this great conspiracy against their beloved WASPness. And next time we return to the Revenge of the Wasp series, we'll examine the third and perhaps final pillar of their WASP revanchist politics, eugenics. Until then, keep your eye on the prize, and don't be fooled by the wackiness of their woo-woo. Fun as it is, it's also probably an omen of things to come for the likely inheritors of post-Trump American fascism, and links them to historical networks, or at least they would like it to link them to historical networks with mystically racist views of power and history, and pretty terrible ideas about what to do with the rest of us. See you later.
You better pray to the Lord when you see those flying saucers. It may be the coming of the judgment day. It's a sign, there's no doubt, of the trouble that's about. So I say, my friends, you'd better start to pray. They're a terrifying sight as they fly on day and night. It's a warning that we'd better mend our ways. You'd better pray to the Lord when you see those flying saucers. It may be the coming of the judgment day. Many people think the saucers might be someone's foolish dream, or maybe they were sent down here from Mars. If you just stop and think, you'd realize just what it means. They're more than atom bombs or falling stars. And though the war may be through, there's unrest and trouble brewing, and those flying saucers may be just a sign that if people